In the summer of 1876, the Beaumont tobacco plantation in rural Kentucky was thriving, its fields stretching endlessly under a smoldering southern sky. The harvest season had arrived, and the need for labor was at its peak. Dozens of workers, mostly black men and women, some indentured, some paid meagerly. Others simply undocumented had been brought in from nearby counties to meet the demand. These seasonal laborers were the invisible gears that kept the plantation machine running. Their names were rarely written down, and their presence was hardly acknowledged by the upper echelons of the Beaumont household. Yet without them, the estate's tobacco empire would have crumbled. That year, however, something unexplainable happened. Over the course of 6 weeks, 41 of these workers vanished without a trace. No farewells, no resignations, no bodies. The first 2 disappearances raised little concern. Workers occasionally fled plantations in search of better pay, better treatment, or simply freedom. But as days passed and the number climbed into double digits, murmurs began circulating among the remaining laborers. They whispered at dusk, near the workers' quarters, sharing theories in hushed tones, afraid that even the trees might be listening. They spoke of strange noises coming from the west fields at night, metallic clinks, deep groaning sounds that seemed neither animal nor man. Others claimed to have seen figures moving silently through the fog before dawn, tall and draped in shadow, retreating when spotted. The Beaumont family remained eerily silent on the matter. Nathaniel Beaumont, the current patriarch, and a stern man with a face carved from marble, dismissed concerns raised by the foreman. He attributed the disappearances to runaways, even as his most loyal overseer, Jonah Pike, argued that the exits and perimeters were always watched and locked. Not a single gate had been breached, no tracks led away from the property. The ground was hard and dry, perfect for footprints, but none were found. As the days rolled into weeks, dread began to settle over the plantation like a sickness. Laborers stopped working after dark. The fields closest to the main manor were abandoned first, followed by the riverbank plots where 5 workers had disappeared within a span of 3 days. Tools were left half buried in soil, wagons overturned, supplies abandoned mid-use. The Beaumonts responded by increasing supervision, arming the overseers and threatening punishment for slacking. But fear is a powerful mutiny. More workers left under cover of darkness, not vanishing this time, but escaping. They never looked back. Only the most desperate remained, those without families, without money, without anywhere else to go. The plantation priest, Father Orrin, a soft-spoken man who held weekly sermons in the chapel behind the manor, took notice of the events with grave concern. He began keeping a private log, cataloging the names of the missing, the dates, and any strange occurrences that surrounded their disappearances. One entry noted that on the evening of July 12th, just after a sudden isolated storm passed through, 3 workers from the western plot vanished. The sky had turned blood-red at sunset, and dogs across the plantation howled until dawn. Another entry detailed how a laborer named Darius claimed to see someone being pulled underground near the tobacco drying barn. No one believed him. The next morning, Darius was gone too. By late August, local rumors had reached the nearby town of Ash Hollow. A small delegation of concerned townspeople and lawmen arrived at the estate, requesting access to investigate. Nathaniel Beaumont met them at the gates and firmly denied any wrongdoing. He claimed he was the target of jealous competitors and that the plantation's workers were free to come and go as they pleased. His words were laced with aristocratic charm and veiled condescension. The visitors left without pressing further. Many feared the Beaumont influence ran deeper than they realized. Unbeknownst to most, a former worker named Silas Gant had returned to Ash Hollow after fleeing the plantation. He bore a permanent limp and a haunted look in his eyes. He claimed that the workers weren't running away, they were being taken. Silas spoke of strange carvings he'd seen in the trees near the western fields, symbols that weren't part of any known language. He described old stone markers hidden beneath the soil, exposed by recent rainfall, and how the ground in certain areas felt hollow. He also described a suffocating cold that enveloped him near the dried-up well behind the chapel, a cold so unnatural that it made him vomit and weep. No one believed him. and yet no one could explain the absences either. What troubled Silas most was a recurring dream he began having before he fled. In it, he stood in the tobacco fields at night, surrounded by rows of tall, withering stalks that whispered in unison. He spoke his name over and over before falling silent as the ground beneath him opened. Something waited below, vast and coiled, reaching toward the surface not with hands, but with intention. When Silas shared the dream with another laborer named Miriam, she gasped and confessed she'd had the same vision. The following night, Miriam vanished in desperation. Silas snuck into Father Oren's chapel before dawn and searched the priest's quarters. He found the journal and quickly copied as much as he could before fleeing for good. He claimed the final entry dated August 22nd read simply, "They are not missing. They have been chosen." After that, there were no more entries. Father Oren was never seen again. Local legends began to take root not long after. The Beaumont Plantation was said to be cursed, the land tainted by ancient wrongs or something older. Some said the original owner, Elias Beaumont Nathaniel's grandfather, had made a pact during the Civil War, exchanging safety from Union soldiers for something hidden beneath the fields. Others claimed that the land had once been a sacred burial ground for a forgotten people, and that the plantation's success was built on a foundation of desecration. The truth, if there was any to be found, lay buried beneath layers of time and silence. Years later, the plantation house would burn in a mysterious fire, reducing much of the estate to ash. No formal investigation took place, and no suspects were named. The western fields grew wild, the tobacco never replanted. Locals still avoided the area, even as nature reclaimed the crumbling fences and overgrown paths. What remained was a void. In the historical record, 41 names that never made it to the books, swallowed whole by soil and silence, leaving behind only stories spoken in low voices and eyes that refused to meet the horizon when passing near Beaumont land. The Beaumont family had long been the ruling name over vast stretches of Kentucky soil. Their plantation established well before the Civil War and surviving its aftermath with uncanny ease. By 1876, their legacy had become mythic in its reach. An enigma, the grandeur of the estate, with its towering white columns and wrought-in balconies draped in ivy, masked a lineage woven with secrecy. The family's wealth was not solely derived from tobacco, as they claimed, but from something deeper, something that not even the local historians dared to explore in public record. At the heart of the estate stood the Cupola Small, archaic structure of stone and stained glass built in a style that did not match the rest of the Southern Gothic architecture. Its design had an older, foreign feel, evoking European catacombs and cloisters more than American churches. Locals called it the Quiet House, and even in the brightest hours of noon, shadow never seemed to lift. The Beaumonts were seen at the chapel more frequently than at church in town. They held private services, never open to the public, led by their own priest, not one sanctioned by any diocese in the state. Father Oren was an enigmatic figure, pale and soft-spoken, who had arrived on the estate one winter without history or credentials. He never visited Ash Hollow, nor did he mingle with the plantation workers. His role seemed tailored only to the Beaumonts, and it was rumored that he lived beneath the chapel itself in quarters carved directly into the stone foundation. No one had ever seen him outside the estate. No one knew where he came from. The family's rituals were odd, but consistent. On the 7th day of each month, fires would be lit inside the chapel regardless of weather, and chanting could be heard echoing across the grounds. The language was unfamiliar, lilting and guttural, not Latin or Greek, but something older, with cadences that made the hair on one's neck stand. It was said that during these rituals, the Beaumonts wore black robes with gold-threaded symbols, stitched across the shoulder, symbols that matched those carved into trees at the western edge of the plantation, where the disappearances later concentrated. Those few workers who ventured too close to the chapel on such nights reported seeing strange lights from beneath the ground, as though the very soil around the building pulsed with heat and color. Others claimed to hear whispers seeping through the stone walls, voices calling them by name in voices that sounded eerily familiar. The Beaumont lineage traced back to French settlers. But old journals hinted at roots stretching further east, possibly into forgotten European blood cults that predated Christianity. The family crest bore not the usual motifs of agriculture or nobility, but an Ouroboros wrapped around an hourglass. To the initiated, it symbolized eternity feeding upon time. To those who lived and worked under their rule, it became a mark of fear. Every portrait in the manor depicted ancestors with the same hollowed gaze, eyes painted darker than natural. And always framed beside a black book bound in skin-toned leather, its title worn down to nothing. No one outside the family was ever allowed to touch it. When asked about it, Nathaniel Beaumont would simply say, "It is our remembrance." Before changing the subject, one surviving journal entry from a former housemaid whose name is only known as L.C. describes a chilling discovery. While cleaning the eastern wing of the manor, she stumbled upon a door she hadn't seen before. It was partly ajar, revealing a narrow hallway lit by flickering gas lamps. The air smelled of burnt myrrh and something iron-rich, like blood. She followed the hall out of curiosity until she reached a staircase spiraling down into the earth. Before she could descend, a hand gripped her shoulder from behind. It was one of the older Beaumont women, Elizabeth, who said only, "That part of the house is not for you." The next day, the maid was dismissed without explanation and paid double the normal severance. She left the state within the week. Other accounts mentioned children in the Beaumont line who were born, lived briefly, and were never spoken of again. Their existence was known only through scattered grave markers in the forest beyond the chaplain marked, but consistently spaced, each aligned with precision. These graves were overgrown, as if purposely allowed to disappear into nature. Local children who played in those woods swore they saw figures kneeling at the stones during twilight, weeping in silence, then vanishing before fully seen. A diary, recovered in later years, attributed to Matilda Beaumont, Nathaniel's sister, shed more direct light. She wrote about a ritual called the Offering of Balance, where once every decade, the land required equilibrium between gain and sacrifice. She never described who made the rules, only that they had been passed down since the plantation's founding. According to her writing, those who worked the land could be selected to become part of it, not killed, but absorbed. She referred to the chapel as the threshold and stated it stood atop the breach that must never open entirely, lest all be reclaimed. Her last diary entry simply read, "Tonight the ground will breathe again," after the 41 workers vanished. The Beaumonts continued as if nothing had happened. They held a formal banquet the following week, inviting guests from across the county, serving fine bourbon and hand-rolled cigars. The workers were replaced quietly, with new laborers brought in from other states, none of whom were told what had happened. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, unease lingered. The chapel remained locked for a full month after the disappearances. Its stained-glass windows darkened with soot from within. Father Orrin was seen walking the grounds with a shovel in hand, his robes wet and trailing something red that the rain failed to wash away. Never spoke to anyone during that time. Years later, construction crew hired to renovate the abandoned manor stumbled upon a sealed stone room beneath the chapel's foundation. Inside were dozens of faded robes, melted candle stubs, and a single iron basin filled with ash. Etched into the walls were lines in the same unidentifiable language heard during the family's rituals. The workers refused to continue the project and left that same day. The room was resealed, and the land above it marked as unstable to this day. The chapel remains the most enigmatic structure tied to the Beaumont legacy. Historians speculate, but never agree. Folklorists write of it in allegories and metaphor, too cautious to declare any single truth. The chapel is never mentioned in official records, nor is Father Orrin. Yet every so often, when the fog rolls thick across the old plantation grounds, travelers claim they hear bells tolling faintly beneath the earth, followed by a voice, low and distant, whispering their name through the tobacco leaves. Beneath the golden fields of the Beaumont plantation lay something far older than the estate itself, an unseen network of tunnels. carved not by water or erosion, but by hands with purpose and knowledge, though their existence was never publicly acknowledged by the family. Traces of the subterranean passages began surfacing shortly after the mass disappearances of 1876. It started with a collapsed cart path near the western tobacco fields, where the ground gave way to a yawning sinkhole. Workers who approached it described a dark shaft lined with stone and timber, descending steeply into the earth. The Beaumonts ordered the hole quickly covered with soil, warning of unstable terrain, but whispers had already taken root. The land, it was said, was hollowed with secrets. Former workers spoke of hearing the faint sounds of movement beneath their feet, shuffling footsteps. Low chants, metallic clatters, even distant cries. At night, especially near the chapel, the earth vibrated subtly, as if something immense was stirring far below. When questioned, the overseers dismissed it as paranoia or the rumble of underground springs. Yet the plantation had no history of seismic activity, no records of caverns or aquifers that could explain the sounds. Those who pressed for answers either left the estate or became part of the missing. A local boy named Curtis Fennell, who used to sneak onto the plantation grounds in search of birds, nests, and raccoons, discovered an entrance hidden in a patch of elderbrush near the river bend. It was framed in mossy brick, almost indistinguishable from the natural terrain, and led into a cool, narrow passage that curved out of sight. Returned the next day with a lantern and ventured inside, managing to travel 50 yards before the air became too thick to breathe. The walls, he said, were covered in carvings, unfamiliar runes, arranged in spirals and interlocked circles. Some depicted figures kneeling beneath a many-eyed being, others showed human forms dissolving into root-like tendrils. When Curtis shared what he saw with his uncle, a local millwright, he was punished and told never to speak of it again. Within weeks, Curtis fell ill with a fever and began mumbling in his sleep, uttering words no one recognized. By winter, he was dead. The tunnels weren't new. Records found in the diary of Harriet Beaumont, the matriarch during the estate's founding years, describe the chambers built for preservation and passage, which predated even her family's arrival in Kentucky. She wrote that the tunnels were gifts left behind by the original keepers of the earth's door, and that her family's role was to maintain them. Some passages led nowhere, others spiraled into what she called breathing vaults. One, she claimed, reached deep enough that the air turned cold and metallic, filled with the scent of burnt cedar and copper. There, she wrote, one could hear the low, steady pulse of the hidden root. Construction workers decades later would unearth one such chamber while clearing land for a new road that would have cut through the old plantation site. The machine struck stone, then metal. Upon investigation, they found an entrance sealed, with a rusted grate. Inside were rows of bones, human, animal, and some unidentifiable. Among them were pottery shards, with engravings similar to the symbols seen around the chapel and trees. Archaeologists brought in to examine the site noted that none of the artifacts matched any known indigenous culture from the region, nor any European influence. They were older, and their purpose obscure. The site was quickly closed, deemed a historical anomaly, and buried again under layers of soil and legal silence. The most enduring story surrounding the tunnels comes from a man named Moses Harrow, one of the last surviving former workers to speak openly about his time on the plantation. In an interview recorded in 1923, Harrow recounted a night in 1876 when he was ordered to assist in loading crates into a hidden cellar beneath the old drying barn. It was late, and only a handful of workers were selected. When they descended the wooden steps, they found a metal trapdoor in the floor, previously unnoticed, that led deeper underground. Beneath it, the air turned cold and stale. The crates they carried weren't tobacco, Harrow claimed, but filled with wax-sealed jars, glass vials, and bundles wrapped in dark cloth. The crates were handed over to a group of robed figures waiting below, their faces covered by hoods. Harrow never returned to that part of the plantation again. The next morning, 2 of the workers from that night were gone. There were theories that the tunnels were part of an old smuggling route used during the early 1800s, possibly by bootleggers or Confederate sympathizers. But none of those explanations aligned with the layout or depth of the network. Some passages extended for miles, well beyond the plantation's borders, surfacing in unexpected places like cave mouths, hollow trees, and long-abandoned wells. Locals learned to avoid these sites, especially after several children disappeared while exploring them. Search parties entered the tunnels, but emerged disoriented and sick, claiming the walls moved and the light from their lamps bent strangely. Compasses refused to work underground, and time felt unreliable watch hands spinning, candles burning too slowly or fast. What disturbed investigators most, however, were the sounds recorded during one failed expedition into the Northern Passage. Using a rudimentary wax cylinder device, the team captured distant wailing and rhythmic thudding that echoed like a heartbeat through stone. The recordings, when played back, caused several listeners to experience vertigo, nosebleeds, and intense emotional episodes. One of the researchers, a man named Emery Lang, later wrote in his notes that the sounds were not echoes, but calls beckonings from something with vast patience. There was speculation that the tunnels connected directly to the chapel's foundation, forming a labyrinth with the building as its heart. The spiral architecture of the underground matched diagrams found etched into the stained glass windows of the chapel itself, suggesting that the entire estate was designed with the tunnels in mind. An intentional layout, a pattern serving a greater design. Those who believed in the ritualistic nature of the disappearances saw the tunnels not as escape routes or hiding places, but as arteries through which something ancient moved, fed, and waited long after the estate was abandoned and nature had reclaimed much of the grounds. Hikers continued to find anomalies, vents in the earth that exhaled warm air, slabs of stone engraved in indecipherable scripts, and sinkholes that formed in perfect circles. One photograph taken by a spelunker in the late 1970s showed a large chamber beneath the southern woods, illuminated by phosphorescent lichen, with a statue at its center. The figure had no eyes, no mouth, and a body covered in root-like tendrils. The image circulated briefly before being dismissed as a hoax. The man who took it disappeared a year later on a return trip to the site. His last known letter spoke of a voice in the deep calling with my father's breath. Despite years of inquiry, the full extent of the tunnels beneath the Beaumont Plantation remains uncharted. Maps drawn by amateur explorers often contradict each other, as though the network shifts over time. What is certain is that the passages were never made for escape or utility, but for worship, movement, and perhaps feeding. Those who venture near them today still report the same sensation at trembling underfoot, a breath in the stone, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched by something buried but never gone. The discovery of a weathered journal inside the attic of the burned-out Beaumont estate changed the way the plantation's history was perceived. Unearthed in 1914 by a historian named Clara Denslow, the journal had somehow survived the blaze that consumed most of the main house decades earlier. Its cover was charred, the leather curled at the corners, and much of the text inside had faded. But what remained readable unveiled something far more disturbing than local legends ever hinted. Written in a spidery, meticulous hand and signed only with the initials E.B. The entries documented not just the daily operations of the estate, but detailed accounts of rituals, harvests, and a system of rotations involving the plantation workers. For years, local memory had been haunted by the inexplicable vanishing of 41 laborers in the summer of 1876. This journal suggested those disappearances were not random tragedies, but deliberate, calculated selections, part of a cycle long held in place by the Beaumont bloodline. The first entry that mentioned a rotation was dated April 17, 1876. It referred cryptically to aligning the workers with the season of intake. Later entries used terms like balanced yield, offerable presence, and threshold priming, suggesting that the family regarded their labor force not as employees or servants, but as vessels. Not all workers were equal in the eyes of the writer. Notes were made beside names, some marked with a simple check, others with symbols like circles, triangles, or spirals. A few had annotations like resonates well or too brittle, will not hold. These cryptic evaluations pointed toward a form of selection that went beyond physical ability or discipline. implying an occult or energetic quality, unique to certain individuals. One chilling passage described an event called the Fourth Quarter Gathering, nighttime ritual involving the chapel, the tunnel entrances, and the East Grove. According to the journal, selected workers were gathered under the pretense of a new work assignment and taken one by one into the chapel basement. They were offered sedatives in their food hours before to make them compliant and calm. The author wrote with disturbing neutrality about how each subject passed through the veil quietly and how the process required a rhythm of silence in return. The phrase "the veil" was used often, always in connection with the chapel, as if the building itself was a doorway between dimensions. This suggested that disappearances were not executions. It's not even sacrifices in a traditional sense, but transitions, conversions of some kind, conducted not for death, but for communion. Another revealing aspect of the journal was the repeated mention of root binding. The writer appeared to believe that the plantation's prosperity was tethered directly to the vitality of the land, which in turn could be fortified by the absorption of human essence. The tobacco plants especially were believed to be conduits, chosen for their deep roots and their ability to inhale the offering. During certain rotations, the selected workers were reportedly buried upright beneath young plants. The soil mixed with oil and ash from previous rituals. A note dated July 3rd read, "9 have been placed. Root depth observed. Growth should be accelerated if alignment holds." The harvest that year was said to be the most profitable in decades, though no public records could verify this only. Oral testimony passed down from frightened descendants. Perhaps the most unsettling entry was one that deviated from ritual procedure. It recounted an incident in which one of the selected workers, a man referred to only as Hollis, resisted the sedative and became aware of the process. He reportedly broke free during the procession to the chapel, screaming that the ground was alive, that he could hear the others already buried calling to him, begging not to be joined. The journal notes that Hollis was taken back quickly and that his fear elevated his potency. That sentence stood out among the rest, suggesting that the intensity of emotion, perhaps terror, amplified whatever energy the ritual was designed to harness. The entry ends by stating that fear-fed soil yields deepest roots. This idea reappeared later, confirming that the emotions of the selected were as essential to the ritual as their bodies. The journal also offered glimpses into how the selection process was rationalized by the family. The writer, presumably Elias Beaumont, or one of his immediate descendants, framed the practice as a sacred duty, an inherited responsibility to maintain balance between the upper and lower realms. There was frequent reference to something called the Silenced Pact, an agreement with an entity referred to only as the bound one beneath. The entity was not named directly, but was described through metaphor: the many-limbed root, the slumbering tongue, the inverted harvest god. Being, according to the journal, granted protection, knowledge, and abundance in exchange for regular offerings of life and memory. The author noted that it did not feed on blood or flesh, but on identity, that the chosen lost not just their bodies, but their very imprint in time. This explained why none of the missing had any traceable documentation, why no graves were found, and why even their families forgot their names over time. The bound one erased them entirely, making their stories in exchange for prolonging the estate's legacy. The writer lamented the difficulty of selection in later years, as fewer suitable workers arrived. In one entry, they noted how the influx of freedmen after the Civil War made rotations more complex, as many came with stronger wills, clearer histories, and families who might inquire. There was a subtle hint of admiration in this admission, though it was clear the family saw such qualities as obstacles. The journal listed new strategies for selection, choosing drifters, migrants, and debtors, people whose absence wouldn't raise alarms. This refined system made the 1876 event more efficient than any previous rotation, and it was evident from the tone that the author regarded that summer as a pinnacle achievement. Clara Denslow's notes from her analysis of the journal added further intrigue. She claimed that while reading it, she experienced auditory hallucinations, a persistent sound like deep, wet breathing, and recurring dreams of standing waist-deep in soil, her legs entwined with something pulsing and warm. She donated the journal to a small regional archive in Louisville, but it was reportedly stolen within months and never recovered. The only remnants of its existence were Clara's transcriptions and her own journals, which ended abruptly in 1915, after she vanished during a research trip back to the plantation site. Her last entry read, "The ground remembers, it remembers me." Even without the physical journal, its contents leaked into local folklore, changing how the Beaumont name was spoken of in town. The disappearances were no longer framed as tragedy, but as design. Families whose ancestors worked on the plantation refused to speak of it openly, while others turned their oral histories inward, preserving them only in family circles. Every so often, someone claimed to have seen a figure digging at night near the site of the old chapel, always silent, always alone. The tools would be left standing in the earth, and by morning new plants would bloom from soil that had never before sprouted anything green. There were no footprints, no tracks of animals, just the faint scent of cedar smoke and the strange, bitter aroma of tobacco curling through the air where no fire had burned in over a century.